Hi, this is Paul. It's Monday for me, Tuesday for you, and some of you in Australia, it's already Wednesday. But there's too much good stuff on the internet. As I mentioned before, I've been playing around with Substack. Why am I playing around with Substack when I already have a blog that nobody reads? Nobody reads my blog because my blog is my file cabinet. I throw all kinds of things in my file cabinet. If you want to see what I'm reading, it's a pretty good thing or at least what I'm noticing on the internet, what can easily be linked to. It's a pretty good way to find that out because I just throw everything up there and scattered ideas and things. That's at leadingchurch.com or paulvanderklay.me. But again, this whole internet thing, YouTube, Twitter, now Substack, it's just all part of learning and trying to figure things out. And you all have been really gracious conversation partners and people who have journeyed with me on my experience of learning. And so that's what this is. And so I get a thought, and often I get a thought in a moment when I don't have time to do anything with it. And I'm finding Twitter to be helpful because the little 280 character limit forces me to put things into little packages. But then, of course, because it's Twitter, I have to put them in little packages. So then I get 4, 6, 8, 10, 15 little packages. And that isn't terribly fun to read on Twitter. And you can use a thread unroll mechanism to unroll that. But that's not terribly nice. And so I thought I'd use Substack. And so I take my tweets and I throw them on Substack. So if you don't want to get on Twitter and you want to see the kinds of things I'm putting a little bit more thought into than my regular blog, which really isn't a blog, it's a file cabinet. You can find that on Substack. And so today I wrote a little piece basically responding to a really nice piece that Peter Limberg wrote for Rebel Wisdom. Peter, of course, runs the Stoa, and the Stoa it's a channel I've been on that some of you know about. It's sort of like Rebel Wisdom, but it's a little bit more conversational, let's say like Bridges of Meaning. It's just in that space of sense making, trying to figure things out. Now, Peter Limberg is an interesting guy, partly because he had John Vervaeke as a teacher and he had Jordan Peterson as a therapist. And yet he begins with, a few years ago, my mentor told me the following: there are no parents upstairs. And he sort of walks through a lot of the meaning crisis stuff, sense making web, Rebel Wisdom, all the usual cast of characters you find in Rebel Wisdom, sense making the landscape. Of course, Limberg wrote that this is a really nice, really nice cartoon of John Vervaeke, which really doesn't do him credit, but it's really rather comical. And Peter Limberg was co-authored that piece, Mimetic Tribes of the Culture War 2.0, which was quite interesting. And I mentioned him at the point. I said, part of the problem of your little mimetic tribes here, and this may be a function of the fact that he's in Canada and not the United States, is that it didn't have anywhere near enough Christians on it, because I agree wholeheartedly with Tom Holland, and I've got video evidence to show that I talked about this long before I ever found Tom Holland, that the culture war is really a Christendom civil war. You can find those in my early videos where I was commenting on Peterson. And then he goes into the meta crisis. And then you look at all of these existential risks, analyzing human extinction scenarios and related hazards, deliberate misuse of nanotechnology, nuclear holocaust, bad programming, superintelligence, resource depletion or ecological destruction, repressive totalitarian global regime. Perhaps we can throw release of a superbug if they still haven't come to a public conclusion on where exactly COVID came from, but to a certain degree, we sort of all got a wake-up call that, wow, life's pretty fragile. And then he goes into, becoming live players together. And for me, this, of course, caught my attention because, well, the great founder theory, a live player is a person or well-coordinated group of people that is able to do things they have not done before. A dead player is a person or group of people that are working off a script and capable of doing new things. It's sort of where you get the non-player character meme. And so you get the idea of, being people who are fully alive. You've used the live player term via an amoral lens and uses both geopolitical and entrepreneurial players like Vladimir Putin and Steve Jobs, for example. We need not be a world leader or a business magnate to be a live player, though. We start playing with what we have, with where we are, and so it's a good piece. And you can find it. The link is below. Rebel Wisdom has a Becoming a Live Player, and they're doing a thing with that. And that sort of inspired this morning's, or one of the two. Yeah, I put out a lot of material, and it doesn't just happen on YouTube. So if you subscribe, so Substack, part of the reason I chose Substack is it's sort of a nice model where, you can get it via email. If you follow me on Twitter, you can find it on Twitter. I don't know. Maybe Rick will decide to program something for the Discord server. I don't know. But the title of it was Sense Making for World Saving. And I notice the annoying habit of Twitter now. Sometimes if I see something and I retweet it quickly, Twitter's like, are you sure you don't want to read it? Oh, Twitter, you're starting to feel the pressure of being a social media echo chamber. Anyway, my friend Rod Hare and David Fuller and Peter Lindbergh, if all these three are talking about something, I have a pretty good idea what they're going to talk about. And so it's worth retweeting. It does sort of remind me, though, how the world saving and soul saving have always been deeply entwined. Save your own soul at the expense of the world, you're a selfish sinner. Save the world at the expense of your soul, noble, but we want to be around to participate and enjoy the rescued world. And you get the sense of that at the end of, it's not Infinity Wars, it's Endgame, when, of course, Tony Stark clicks his fingers and saves the world and dies, and there's the sad, poignant, meaningful funeral, and all of our hearts at that moment say, but wouldn't it be better if Tony Stark could enjoy the world he saved? It reminds me of Luther's conversion. I know we're a bit cloyed that every single movie is being about the end of the world and somebody saving the world, and terrifically ironically in an age when people look around and say, but that's what an archetypal story is. You can't make a story that goes outside of it. Luther had a crisis in his journey, and it was brimming with meaning. And this is Luther's conversion from going to study law, as his father wanted to becoming a monk. And then, of course, as a monk, he would cause way more trouble than he ever did in his early life. This lifted from a biography. And what better could he do than take the cowl, go into a monastic order? Men believed the end of the world already had been postponed for the sake of the Cistercian monks. Christ had just bidden the angel blow trumpet for the last judgment, when the Mother of Mercy fell at the feet of her son, and besought him to spare a while, at least for my friends of the Cistercian order, that they may prepare themselves. The very devils complained of Saint Benedict as a robber who had stolen souls out of their hand. He who died in the cowl would receive preferential treatment in heaven because of his habit. And I immediately thought of that when I read the Peter Lindbergh piece, because soul saving and world saving, as you very much see in Rebel Wisdom, in all of their talks, they both have the Game Bee and the Schmachtenberger and all of those kinds of talks. And so, well, I've got a meaning crisis, but so what? We've got to save the world. And of course, it's meaningful to save the world. And, well, that's exactly what was happening with Luther. He wants to participate in the salvation of the world, and he gets the salvation of his soul. 2 for 1, all the better. And of course, that would continue to motivate him on through the monastic order into the Protestant Reformation. You see, it can't be just about me. It has to be about everything. But where do I and everything intersect meaningfully and open-endedly? God is, of course, the historic term we're looking for. But the moment you domesticate him, you slip back into a meaning crisis. You want both to be hero, and you want to be the damsel for which the hero moves heaven and earth to love. It's a difficult story to construct. Good thing it's already been done. Now, if it's just a story, that's exciting, but ultimately disappointing and unsatisfying. We want to dress up and act, recreate, anticipate, long, and expect. Every moment of our life in the cyculum must find its place in it while reaching beyond it. Where else can I find this but in Christ? I am disciple and bride. I am lover and beloved. I am child and midwife. I am always on the verge of being lost, but never out of reach of his grip. I understand why people think it's too good to be true. Now, those of you who have been following along know I've been talking a lot about storytelling. And I think we're paying a lot of attention to storytelling now because we're sort of stuck trying to break out of the iron box of modernity, try to break out of our buffered selves, and we want to somehow be able to orient ourselves correctly in the universe. And so we're always looking for these little dead reckoning devices. And that's a big thing with Peterson because, again, meaning, do what's meaningful, not what's expedient. That's sort of a dead reckoning device. And he finds that as helpful. Now, I just had a tweet yesterday. Hang on. Maybe I substacked it. I guess I didn't. Every time I have this after, I think I started using my blog as a file cabinet in 2007. And even before that, in other iterations before the current one that's online. And I start these mechanisms to try to capture thoughts, and I can't catch them all. They're like, little Pokemon, little pocket monsters that I don't quite have enough time to throw out those balls and catch all those little pocket monsters that pop up in my head. But we're using storytelling, and we're paying attention to storytelling because, again, stories are this massive compression engine by which we can navigate the world successfully, and it's the most it's how we talk to each other, it's how we construct these maps, it's how we do almost everything. And so because we're sort of dead reckoning with these stories, they're small, they're blunt, they're crude, but they're often the best we've got. But even if you just pay attention to the stories, and I think again Pageau's parasitic storytelling video, I told Jonathan, I want to get that video to 1 million views because it's one of the most important things we do, because just like you can use meaning to sort of dead reckon as a buffered self, you can also use storytelling because you can find some stories are more satisfying than others. And then you can ask, why are those stories more satisfying than others? And how are these stories revelatory? And so I'm going to play a little bit of Jordan Peterson and Randall Wallace's conversation a little bit later. And at some point, I'm thinking I'll probably do the full treatment of Jonathan Pageau's universal storytelling video, because I thought that really hit on a bunch of things that is sort of integrating all of the various pieces of this strange journey that I'm on and you're graciously going with me on. But then I didn't want this video to fall through the cracks. Not just because I consider both Benjamin and Jonathan Pageau to be friends, not just because if those two talk, I'm going to eat up every word and listen to the video multiple times, but because there's some really important things in it. And part of the reason I will pay attention to them is because I know there'll be some things in it. And again, part of why it's important to me to facilitate a community around these ideas is because, status, and there's this journey of diminishing returns that happens with status and size. You can still sort of, Jonathan Pageau's been on Jordan Peterson sort of took a status rocket fueled by a culture war. Pageau's been on a status staircase and going up and up. But the speed is good because it's not as disorienting, and he can actually pull people with him now. And same for Benjamin Boyce. I've much been my YouTube channel's been in the slow cooker category, so we'll let it simmer a bit, and that's probably due to the quality of my offerings, but there we have it. I really liked this conversation, and there were some pieces of it. I know a conversation is important, at least important to me, because certain pieces of it get stuck in my consciousness congress and linger. And when things happen, they sort of get pulled back to the front. And if I in some ways, I can lay some of these things to bed if I put them in a video, which is a really funny thing too. But so let's get into this video. Before I do that, I should say that someone sent me a really nice set of headphones, and I really appreciate the gift. And they said it because I see you wearing these, and actually I tried the others. These have a cord and they have no mic, and so they're not as comfortable as the pair you sent me, but they're sort of anti-fragile in this sense. And if I connect up with Bluetooth, but I'm using that other set of headphones that you gave me, so thank you for your gift. It was very generous. So anyway, here we go.
Okay, so insofar as you're trying to provide space for other people to do this work, so that this work of making sense of reality, let's say, continue.
And again, this is part of, because Jonathan is more on a status elevator or a status stairway, he can actually continue to build an infrastructure beneath him rather than just shooting up, getting, and then having to figure it all out in a, cloud of terror.
Beyond you. How do you impart to them the correct method, or let's just say how to be balanced in organizing? There's a lot of organization. This is basic organization. And human beings, our minds, our feelings, and our imaginations get really unwieldy really quick.
Well, one of the things that first of all can help is that if you bounce your ideas off other people, that is definitely, like, people who think about symbolism and are just kind of alone in their own little world and just mull it over, they tend to go crazy after a while.
That's why we talk about these things together. And many of you in the comment section will tell me I'm crazy, or not just a few of you. Those who tell me I'm crazy, I appreciate your comments, because I probably am. And actually, I can learn from you, but they don't tend to hang around too long, because why would you listen to a crazy man's video? Now, there's a few of you that have been quite persistent in telling me I'm crazy, and so then I begin to wonder, why would you hang around and listen to a crazy man's video?
It's not good. It's good to exchange. And then, second of all,
we, as Peterson says too, we keep ourselves sane this way. This is all of this auto-correction that we're doing, because in a lot of ways, it's about heaven and earth and trying to keep heaven and earth connected. And so the only way we do that is to keep checking on each other. And this is why community is so foundational and important.
It's always about, so let's say the idea that there's a pattern, say the pattern of the temple, we can use that as an example, that pattern of a temple scales up and down. And so if you want to understand, so people will, let's say, read a story or watch a movie, and then they want to know whether the pattern they perceive is a real pattern.
Okay, that is a very interesting question. They watch a story, they want to know if it's a real pattern. What does he mean by that? This is where we get into this strange word, real, and in some ways we've been chasing this word for 3 years. I don't think we're going to catch it. We won't catch it in my lifetime. I don't think. I think we might be pursuing this word for all of eternity, but not in frustration. Is it a real pattern? Means, is it going to happen again? Does it happen regularly? Is it something that I can, I've talked lately a lot about the narrative and the data. And Peterson's going to articulate that in the portion of the video I'm going to play a little bit later in a much better way than I can. But is it a pattern in the world? And what are we doing? Well, we see a pattern and we sort of take that pattern and map it onto, our ever-growing, it starts as a first draft, our ever-growing internal map. And once we have that pattern mapped, then we can begin to relate to the pattern in a predictable way, back and forth, back and forth. And so storytelling, being this massive compression engine, is part of how we're managing patterns, okay? And so there's a pattern out in the world. Some author basically takes it and maps it in a way that we can accept and map it onto ourselves. And of course, the story outside and the story inside are deeply connected. So our internal maps are part of these much broader, larger maps. Our experience of our maps are, of course, in some ways unique, because all of us have sort of unique lives, because the world is just so incredibly rich and diverse and complex, yet the patterns are there. And so that's what we're doing.
Whether it's just their own imagination. Usually the way to do it is to see if it scales. So for example, does it scale in the movie itself? Let's say if you're watching a movie, that's one thing. So for example, like the overarching theme that you see, can you see it at lower levels in the movie? And so
now this is enormously abstract because, without an example, okay, what are you talking about? But is this a pattern that scales? Is it like a fractal? Is it down here and then is it bigger and bigger? Yesterday, maybe this will be a Sunday leftover sermon. Yesterday I preached my sermon, and you can find it on the church channel. I thought it went quite well Sunday morning. It was a little bit longer. It's about 40 minutes instead of 30. Somebody asked the question, why don't I put he said finish. It's probably autocorrect on his phone. Capital Finnish. Why don't I put my Finnish sermons? And of course, the troll inside of me said, I can't speak Finnish, and so I can't preach Finnish sermons. But finished sermons, well, they're never really finished either. But I keep them on my church channel because the sound isn't as good. Because when I started this channel, I knew there was going to be something with respect to a big head in the screen and a voice that sounds good, and it can be podcast. And so all of that is, for the most part, why I for the most part, keep this kind of content on this channel. And if you're really curious about what happened on Sunday morning, you can watch the church channel. But that's a very different thing. And it will always be, and now that COVID has been here, and a number of our members, once more and more of them are coming back now that they've gotten their vaccinations and they're feeling a little bit more secure, and so now they're back in the sanctuary, and they're like, oh, this is so much better in person. Yeah, it is. But so I was making the point in my Sunday sermon about this pattern of sacrifice of that the mother. This gets into Vervaeke agape, how the child becomes human via the sacrifice of the mother. And yet we grow to a certain point, and if the child never really grows up and becomes mature, the definition of maturity is that they reproduce. But even in the process of maturity, you gain. In other words, you know what it is to receive love if you have good parents and you're growing up and you grow up into their love. But once you get to a certain point where you are now the one giving the love, if you have a child yourself, now you understand it from the parent's side. And so you're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I talked about that a little bit in my Substack piece. But this, I think, is what Pageau is talking about in terms of if it scales. Does it scale in the movie? Is it, what we're basically worried about is eisegesis. Exegesis is reading the pattern out of the text. Eisegesis is reading the pattern onto the text. And so this little reality check that Pageau is talking about is a question, is the pattern really there, or am I projecting onto the text?
So can you notice that the little actions that the main character are playing out the same pattern that you see at the larger scale? So that's one thing. But then also, does that pattern exist in other stories? So can you find it in other fairy tales, in other movies, and other stories? And if not, you're probably off, because the patterns are just the patterns of, or maybe not completely off, but you need to keep working at it, because these patterns, they're the very way you recognize a story usually. Like even the idea that the capacity you have to recognize that something has a beginning and an end.
Now, one of the little videos I did last week was about extraordinary events and extraordinary evidence. And one of the points I made in that video was about an event. Even the recognition of an event, and Pageau basically made this point, the recognition that something is a story is itself, this isn't objective, and I'm going to really hate that word. It's not just out there that this is a significant event, relevance, realization. And the way we know it is because it's part of a story, and Peterson will say that better than I can when I play his clip.
That something has a movement within it, that you recognize that these different events are related to each other, right? That it's not arbitrary. You can't just make that up. We have a way of attending to facts that make us understand that things are related to each other, and that's an objective thing. Or else you wouldn't be able, like if that didn't exist, you would walk outside and then all the millions of facts would just impose themselves on you in a way that you wouldn't be able to sift through.
And the point Pageau just made there is exactly the point that Peterson kept trying to make to Sam Harris in the Vancouver One Talk, that there has to be a pattern. And Pageau's point is that and this is part of where he says that it's an objective pattern. And what he's trying to say is that the pattern isn't just in you. The pattern is much more broadly mapped. Now, in a sense, the deceit of, and Pageau actually had a conversation with Steve DeYoung where they talked about this a little bit, and I haven't gotten all the way through that video yet. But the goal is to find something. In a sense, this quest for pattern recognition goes on forever. And we are not satisfied until we can see everything. But again, now that you're bumping into the word God again. Because and this again is it has to be God number one and God number two in all of its fullness. Because if your God number two is basically like a superhero that within the meta-divine realm, and you're not seeing everything, you're only seeing the God within the meta-divine realm. If you need to see everything, that's what you have to look at with God. And the problem is that you can't see everything. And so this is something that we continue to grow in infinitely, which is why Christianity doesn't shrink away from eternity, whereas The Good Place or Upload do.
Yeah. But the fact that we can do that means that there's a hierarchy of attention that we have, and that hierarchy has a shape, and you can describe it.
Okay. So, but that work is related to harvesting meaning. It can be creative in and of itself, and an adventure, a detective story. There's aspects of that too, but it seems like if you're going into a work of art with a premeditated plan, I'm going to show the archetypical monomyth or whatever, it's going to be very monotone.
That is a great line, Benjamin. I'm going to show the monomyth. It's going to be monotone.
There is
hopefully it's not, because that monomyth is not good enough.
There's blindness in creativity. There's an energy, a transcendent energy, like a boiling passion or something like that I need to anchor myself in and let the meaning happen afterward. What are your thoughts on that aspect?
Now, this is where on the slide I say, you don't start with the archetype. You recognize the patterns. And I'll just play Benjamin again there.
Activate. And boy, there's blindness in
hopefully it's not, because that monomyth is not good enough.
There's blindness in creativity. There's an energy, a transcendent energy, like a boiling passion or something like that I need to anchor myself in and let the meaning happen.
It's a really interesting way that Jonathan is conceptualizing it there. I mean, because his blindness, I don't think is darkness. I think we talk about a blinding light. Blindness, again, can be imagined as darkness, but also blinding light. What is a blinding light? There's too much to see. And so, and actually the blinding light and the darkness can sort of be in one of these circles, because I'm getting really esoteric with that.
And afterward, what are your thoughts on that aspect of it? And how does that relate to that sowing of meaning relate to the harvesting of meaning?
I totally agree. I totally agree with you. So a lot of people ask me about that. They'll tell me things like, I'm trying to write a story, let's say, and I'm really struggling to put the symbolism in the story. And I'm like, dude, you got it wrong. Don't do that. That's not the right way to go about it.
And that point right there, that's what has been haunting me, what he said right there, because it's so true, and we all know it, that well, what are we trying to do? That's sort of a very, again, I'm brutal on my own tradition, but it's mine. I can be. Now, okay, so here's our framework. Here is the pattern that we have sort of dissected and articulated and put out there. Now I'm going to use that pattern and construct a story on it. Now maybe is that what Lucas did in creating Star Wars by taking the monomyth and just, following it along? Well, not really. It probably helped him in terms of some turns of events in the story, but the point of it is that when we as sub-creators, we feel ourselves under the sway of something larger. And this is, someone made a comment on one of my videos that I thought was really helpful, and I had no idea about any of this, that I guess the Hindus wrestled with this in terms of, that which is the impersonal versus the personal, the agentic. And that's as I've continued to play with God number 1 and God number 2, that's really sort of where I've been camping, that God number 1 is arenic, that's God as arena, and God number 2 is agentic, that's God as an agentic being, personal within the arena. Because one of the things that I noticed years ago is that everyone was all excited about, I think we're in terror of the living God, as rightfully so. And so we wish the living God away. C.S. Lewis made this point again and again, because he said, oh yeah, pantheism, everybody loves pantheism. Because why? Because then we're the agent within the arena and we get to have our way, because agents have all of this power. We have reason, we have telos, we have all of this equipment by which we can reshape the arena. That's what human beings do. And so to hear that God is the force that we can somehow appropriate and wield and use to our desires and outcomes and ends, well, that gets us very excited, which is exactly why people are, on one hand, necessary and delightful, and also terrifying in the world, because we very quickly learn that they're people too, and they're agents too. And so, and then the thought that there is finally at the core of the universe agency that is going to have his own way with us, masculine pronoun intentionally used, terrifying, that we are the feminine and he is the masculine, and he's going to have his way with us. Something is exciting about that, but something is terrifying about that. And so, okay, I'm going to write an archetypal story and it's going to be monotone. You can't do it. Okay, so if you can't do it, how do we subcreate? What is happening in us? And again, in modernity, it was the great science experience. It was the great scientific trick that leaked out of the lab and went viral around the world. That scientific trick of taking all agency and subject out of the world, and got out of the lab, and now everything's impersonal. And it's the whole. You find something that's a really fun trick, and you just keep doing it again and again and again and again and again until it plays itself out. And I think that's basically where we're at in terms of modernity. It's played out. It's done. Now the question is, okay, what does it mean to own up to that? And the question in this context is, where do stories come from? How do they well up within us? We don't know. They come unbidden. They're revelatory. And again, we'll get into that in the Peterson section.
You have to obey the rules of the things you're doing, like in the moment that you're doing it, in the sense that
that's very submissive of us, isn't it? You have to obey the rules of the thing you're doing in the moment you're doing it. It's like, well, what thing am I doing? And why did people call it a muse of all things? Why did they personalize it and probably made it feminine because that was less scary than Prophet Jeremiah's fire in our belly.
You're create, and then like let's say you're writing a story, then you should not think about symbolism when you're writing your story.
You should give way to the thing, to the story that is colonizing you. You know, Lewis wrote about that. You can write that. You can read about that in Alan Jacobs' biography of Lewis called The Narnian, because once Aslan came into the story, he pulled the rest of the story through with him. Well, who was writing the story?
And once you've written, let's say your first draft, then you can go back and do some editing if you need to. But while you're writing, you wouldn't want to think about symbolism because it'll cripple you. And people, that's what happens. People get totally crippled by their desire.
Not crippled. They get impotent. They get fruitless. They can't produce.
To insert symbolism into their story, that the story has its own logic, and then once you see it, then that logic you can fine tune it later, right, to make it more what it is. But it's not about trying to.
You can enhance it. You can make it more of what it is, but it's something that has come through you more than from you.
Jam symbolism into the story. It's not gonna. Yeah. You're not gonna be very successful if you try to do that.
Well, what is the symbolism of that point of being, that creative point of being? That it sounds blind to me in a way that the symbolist or the interpreter, the hermeneut, is really looking at things. The poet, in the broadest sense of the one who assembles, the one who makes, is blind to that. So what is the stance, or can you express and explore what are the qualities of that?
Well, for sure, the symbolist is second tier. I often kind of, the people don't realize that one of the reasons why I'm doing this is because the world is so messed up. This is not a natural way of going about things. Like,
in some ways, Jonathan Pageau is an artist, and the world is a really annoying neighbor that comes along and says, "Can you show me what you're doing? Why are you doing this? What's going on?" Poor Jonathan Pageau has now been reduced where I want to do art. Now you just have to talk and explain to us exactly what you're doing.
Understanding symbolism is a second-hand thing. That's not what it's. Traditional societies didn't have like science of symbolism. Why would they do that? They don't need that. They're living inside of a pattern, and they're
see, and even that. I mean, I made a video about this, but one of the Substacks that I did was, when Jonathan says that they're living inside of a pattern. Oh, what you know that your audience are wimps. And you know that you're going to have to sort of comfort them and not tell them what actually is going on about what a feminine creature they are, because someone else is calling the shots, pulling the strings, moving through them, creating, becoming, addressing, forming. That's what's happening. And so, well, we'll just call it a pattern. Oh, okay. I guess a hurricane is a weather pattern. I guess a earthquake is a seismic pattern. Yeah, you can call it a pattern, but if you've ever lived through a hurricane, pattern sounds like the kind of thing you'd tell a fearful child. Not the full thing.
Living it, right? They're expressing it. They're embodying it, let's say. And so it's only in the breakdown, let's say, it's only at the end that all of a sudden you can, first of all, you can talk about it because you're moving away from it. And second of all, maybe you need to talk about it if you don't want to get lost in the darkness, or if you want to get lost in the brokenness. Because as the pattern kind of breaks down, let's say as society fragments and as identities fragment, there's an opportunity there, but there's a big danger of just getting lost, and then not finding your way. So the idea of from that moment of chaos and breakdown to be able to point to the line, to point to the pieces of bread that have been dropped along the way, that's kind of what I think the work of the symbolist would be.
Okay.
But that's not enough, and you're right. That's not sufficient.
Yeah.
That's why I tell people, like, I kind of joke around, and I'm not joking, I'm serious, but I tell people, you can watch my videos all you want, but at some point you have to go to church. Like, you have to sing, you have to embody, you have to live it. You can't just think about it, or else it's not going to give you anything. It's going to be, but it can be.
It's like you can watch all the fishing shows you want. You can see the dude by the big bass boat. You can see him out there in the lake. You can see him pull in the big fish, yada, yada, yada. But it's better to fish. Get out on the lake. Yeah, but there's like stuff to buy and things to do, and it takes time and it takes money, and the boat may sink and there are storms. Yeah. You want to live? Or you want to live in your little piddly existence and talk about it your whole life? You're going to have pornography? Or are you going to actually try and go out there and meet a real woman? Trust me, a real woman is far more terrifying than a picture on a screen.
It's a good wake up for people that are kind of in the chaotic breakdown, but it's not enough, that's for sure.
Yeah. Is it Fukuyama that wrote then The End of History? I think in the late 90s. There's an author who wrote about the end of history, post-Soviet, post-Cold War. Maybe he was right and we're stuck in the footnotes now.
Well, history's coming back pretty fast.
Fair enough.
It's like, I don't know. I mean, I think I understand what he meant, but I think that it's coming back in the sense that there's a breakdown that's going on. There's a breakdown of the story, and it has.
Okay, now when Jonathan Pageau says that, and he says it a lot, what does he mean? So now I'm interpreting the interpreter. Now I'm exegeting the exegete. Well, we live within a story, and in some ways, as he just said, in terms of story makers, we live in that story unselfconsciously. Because there's no need to sort of pull ourselves out and look at ourselves doing it, because we're just doing it. We're living it in the moment. It's really tough for a professional NBA player to look at themselves while they're shooting. Now, as they go through tapes and they work on things. Yeah, but the whole point of the practice, which is what worship is, the whole point of the practice is to be able to do it so you're not thinking about it. Because in that way, that certain kind of thinking is your enemy. And so when Pageau says where the story is breaking down, we're discovering that we're no longer just able to do it anymore. We're noticing our hands. We're recognizing our mind. We're doing all of this stuff.
It has a function, but it's not. It didn't lead to this kind of just stasis, utopian stasis that he thought maybe what he thought he was talking about. It doesn't lead to Star Trek. I know a lot of people think it leads to Star Trek. It doesn't. It doesn't lead to a world with like Christian values without religion, where you explore the world with these Christian values. Like that doesn't happen.
That brings up something that kind of initiated this particular conversation. Richard Dawkins asked a question about why one person can't change races, but they can change sex.
Okay, there's a little teaser. It goes on. And it's a great conversation. It hasn't gotten a lot of views, surprisingly enough, even given the relative size of Benjamin's channel and Jonathan's channel. It was only posted on Benjamin's channel, and I think it would probably be of more interest to Jonathan's channel. But as Andrea with the bangs noted, Benjamin's got a whole nother side, and most of his channel, I think a lot of his audience looks at Benjamin and says, he's talking about Evergreen and he's talking about the transgender issue. But Benjamin actually has bigger fish to fry that I don't know how ready his audience is for those fish. Now, those of you who watched my 3-hour commentary on the Unbelievable broadcast with Tom Holland noted that, well, I noted that he was talking about something that I didn't exactly know what he was talking about. A number of you, including Strawn, who sent me the Wikipedia article, was talking about Jorge Luis Borges. Now, someone also on Twitter sent me an interview with Tom Holland that's online where the interviewer is speaking French and Tom Holland is responding in English, but I don't understand French, so I didn't get a lot of that conversation. But in that interview with Justin Brierley, he was talking about how would you say this? Because it's Borges in Spanish, a soft G, it sounds more like an H, Borges. Borgesian, I guess that's how we'd say it, Borgesian conundrum. And this gets into this whole question of agency, which is really very interesting. So a Borgesian conundrum, the philosophical term Borgesian conundrum is named after him, and it has been defined as the ontological question of whether the writer writes the story or it writes him. And so when Pageau is talking about, I'm going to write a symbolic story. Here's all the symbolism I want to put in the story. Boom, 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 boom. Actually, if you want to write a story, what you're probably going to have to do is figure out how to be the kind of person and live the kind of life which will attract the story. Now, again, in a modernistic frame, that sounds very wooey. But I don't think it's out of reach for a lot of people like ourselves who have been deeply impacted by modernism. Jonathan Haidt almost gets at it with his rider and his elephant, because if you want to change the elephant, the rider doesn't talk the elephant into a new elephant way. You change the path. You change the herd. That's how you change the elephant. If you want to write a certain kind of story, if you want to live a certain kind of story, you're going to have to change the elements of your life that attract the story you want to inhabit. So this Borgesian conundrum, whether the writer writes the story or it writes him. The original concept was put forward by Borges in Kafka and his Precursors. After reviewing works that were written before those of Kafka, Borges wrote, "If I am not mistaken, the heterogeneous pieces I have enumerated resemble Kafka. If I am not mistaken, not all of them resemble each other." So in other words, and again, if you think about this very long, it appears right. So if you look at all of Paul van der Klee's precursors, I talk about Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau and Tom Holland and N.T. Wright and Dallas Willard and my father and, all of these precursors to Paul van der Klee. There's all of them in Paul, but it's only Paul that sort of puts them together in the way that Paul puts them together, partly because, Pageau and Peterson and Vervaeke and Holland are out there in the public world, but Paul van der Klee's father, well, that's kind of unique to Paul. There's a whole group of other people that know Paul van der Klee's father, et cetera, but so we're talking about precursors here. The second fact is the most significant. In each of these texts, we find Kafka's idiosyncrasy to a greater or lesser degree. But if Kafka had never written a line, we would not perceive this quality. In other words, it did not exist. Let me read that again, because it's really key. The second fact is the more significant. In each of these texts, we find Kafka's idiosyncrasy to a greater or lesser degree. So Kafka is idiosyncratic, and we look at these precursors, we can find those idiosyncrasies of Kafka in the precursors. And you say, well, yeah, that's the definition of a precursor. But the point he makes is we would never have recognized those patterns in the precursor text if it had not been for Kafka. You can look at that in terms of my sermon on Sunday. You might never have noticed the pattern of sacrifice and substitution that you find in a mother, that you find in a parent, that you find in a family, that you find in that Vervaekean agapic sense of this. You know, I know John got in trouble with Esther in this, but the point that John is making is, if you abandon your baby in the woods, will it get raised by wolves or just eaten? And if a baby would be raised by wolves, and we've played with this in terms of fiction, would the child be human? This gets into Brett Weinstein's, you've got the genetic track and the culture track. So now you have this with these precursors and then with Kafka. And in other words, Jesus is the mysterium. When Jesus comes along, he becomes the interpretive framework by which, let's assume that the Old Testament are the precursors of Christ. That's very clear when you read the Gospels. But you only notice them when you see Christ. That's almost exactly the definition of mysterium that the Apostle Paul uses in the epistles. I'm going to read it again because it's important. The second fact is even more significant. In each of these texts, we find Kafka's idiosyncrasy to a greater or lesser degree, but if Kafka had never written a line, we would not perceive this quality. In other words, it would not exist. The poem Fears and Scruples by Browning foretells Kafka's work, but our reading of Kafka perceptibly sharpens and deflects our reading of the poem. Browning did not read it as we do now. Something changed. So in this conversation about the Old and New Testament that we see with Brierley and Tom Holland, this is what Tom Holland was talking about. I didn't know it because I'd never read this, but now in the critic's vocabulary, the word precursor is indispensable, but it should be cleansed of all connotations of polemics or rivalry. The fact is that every author creates his own precursors. His work modifies our conception of the past as it will modify the future. Wow. The Borgesian conundrum is a big deal, and it has a lot to do with all of these post-resurrection texts where Jesus keeps, in some ways, modulating the Old Testament. And it's one of the patterns after the resurrection. Jesus, and you see, Jesus couldn't do this until after the resurrection to show the disciples the resurrection in the Old Testament. Now, this frustrates people because then they read this in John and Luke and they're like, well, why didn't Jesus say it? Well, I would have to argue that it's said by the apostles, because remember, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't writing feverishly as life was going on. These texts are written after the events. And so actually the patterns are built into all of the texts that we are reading in the New Testament. Now I want to go to Peterson's talk with Randall Wallace. Now, when I saw this conversation with Wallace, I didn't know who Wallace was. I listened to a little bit of it and thought, Peterson is chasing famous people again. But then another famous people who are interesting to him. And yeah, Braveheart, and if you sort of understand the masculinity theme of Peterson, it makes perfect sense. And then if you look at the sword and the plaid and freedom on the fireplace and the Celtic cross and all this stuff behind Wallace, but I didn't know who Wallace was. And then I just kept getting messages from many of you, that conversation. And I listened to it. First time I listened to it, as I often do, that particular evening, I woke up at like 4 a.m. and okay, I don't want to wake my wife up and I don't want to bother her. And so sometimes what I do is I just put on a podcast like this. And I thought, oh, okay, it's in podcast form, so I'll just listen to it. But I didn't correctly set the sleep timer, because I do that because I learned years ago that if I listen to something and then if I fall back asleep, which I often do, the podcast gets integrated in my dream. And that can often be sort of an annoying thing, because then I have all these crazy dreams about I'm trying to turn the podcast off and I can't turn it off, and I'm taking off the headphones and I'm taking off the head. I can't. It's a whole Inception type thing. Well, anyway, it happened that night because I miscalculated just how much podcast there was. And so then I was having this dream while these two were talking, and I was dreaming that I was in this large hotel banquet room. And these two were sitting in the table next to me having this conversation. And I thought, well, that's, I'm interested in Jordan Peterson. And I start listening to the conversation. I felt a little embarrassed because I was eavesdropping, but they're talking so loud, and it was a weird dream. And they were bringing me all these different foods. And then for some reason, they, I don't know, the hotel ballroom chaotic catastrophes start happening in the hotel ballroom. There are, as there are sometimes in these big hotel atriums, there were these balconies and things, and they were crashing, and people were dropping from windows and doors all over the place. And I'm looking around, and these two are just talking like nothing's going on. And I'm like, and then before you know it, I guess, things were getting so chaotic and my table was still intact. Then they moved into the table with me, and I was a little embarrassed by the whole thing, but okay, if you really want to have, and they just kept talking, and the room just kept getting crazier and crazier, and on the conversation went, and, I couldn't figure out why they didn't stop the conversation and say, hey, well, people are falling to their death. But on they talked. And then, of course, and then woke up sufficiently to realize, oh, I'm still listening to the stupid podcast, and turn it off. And then at that point, it was like, I heard a few interesting things in my sleep, but it didn't really grab my interest. But then the emails and the messages kept coming about this conversation. And so, okay, I've got to listen to this while I have all my faculties. And there really is, this is sort of a quintessential Rando's conversation, except the story is in Randall Wallace's story, and it's a great story, and it's really well told. It's in the second half of the video, not the front half, as it usually is with me. Now they're talking about all of the Peterson stuff, but back to the kinds of things we were talking about in this video, about storytelling and about revelation and about, do we write the story, or does the story write us? And if the story writes us, what does that say about what we are? And when we figure out what we are, how then should we live?
And just start to finish. And I grew up Southern Baptist. So ever since I could read, I've read the Bible virtually every day of my life. But I'd never read the Bible start to finish. And there were some books that, even when I was a religion major at university, I would get to some of the books and go, I can't stay awake for this book. I just got to move on. But when you really go through it and you see the Old Testament as this incredible saga of a people trying to find the rules that kept them together as a people.
Okay, now, that whole question of what do we want? What are we looking for? At what point will we be satisfied? Again, I started out reading my Substack. At what point will we be satisfied? And so what is Israel looking for? Well, you can read in Deuteronomy. And if you read, for example, at the end of Deuteronomy, the covenant blessings, well, it's a pretty good thing of what they're looking for. And you can find it in various points in the prophets. And so, okay, they're trying to figure out the rules, and that's a valid conceptualization, because fulfill the rules and things will go well. It's looking for the patterns. It's trying to discern the patterns. And if you figure out what the patterns are, if you find the patterns out there and you map them individually and communally as a people, as sort of a Voltron, as you put yourself together, then you can enact the patterns and you can, bring in the life you've always wanted.
And who felt If you disobey these rules, then it's going to end badly for us all. And the greatest violation is to erect altars to other gods.
Oh, right.
And that, when contemporary pluralistic people hear that, they always react in, oh, well, that's just tribalism. Oh, okay. But I would be more accepting of that if these same pluralistic people actually lived that out. Instead, sort of what's happened in the Protestant milieu is that we're way too sophisticated to have gods in spandex with letters on their chest and capes, and we're far too sophisticated to imagine that we represent gods as persons. Well, how exactly are you doing it? And before you knew it, they're looking around for stars that they navigate by, because those stars are embodying the values that they're seeking out and wishing to emulate. So, when I hear people complain about pluralism, that, well, it was just Israel, and, why not worship all the gods? Oh, I don't know. Why not be a Nazi? Well, no, you can't be that. Well, why not? Well, that would be wrong. Okay, so why do you work really hard to keep those ideas and those people who hold those ideas out of your country, out of your society? It's the same game. You're just not dressing up anybody in spandex.
Worship false idols, yeah.
That's the worst one. And then along comes Jesus, who is completely steeped in all of that Old Testament. I mean,
okay, so the Old Testament are his precursors, but what he's going to do is modulate all of those precursors.
He is profound in his knowledge of it, and he lives and does and says these things, but it's not like it's a philosophy. It's a narrative which...
Okay, it's not like, and when he says it's not like a philosophy, what does he mean? Because philosophy is that thing you go to in class. And it's complicated, and it's esoteric, and it's abstract. It's not like a philosophy. It's like a narrative. Oh, this thing that we've been, ever since the age of 3 or 4, been continuing to perfect and been used to, probably more than any other tool we have, to try to navigate our way in the world.
I've studied a great deal, and I believe is largely historical, or I should say significantly historical.
And so why is that important? Well, it's important because if it's something that has been instantiated in the world, that gives us an idea of it can happen again. If Peter did walk on water for just a few steps and then lost it, that means that water walking is possible. If Jesus did rise from the dead, no longer to decay again, and ascend to sit at the right hand of the Father, that means that, as the hymns say, heaven's doors are open. Well, when you say heaven's doors are open, what does that mean? It means it used to be shut. It means, and so that historical aspect is vitally important. Now, the stories that relay the patterns are important. We look for those, but we're most excited about, it's exciting to hear that, the Apollo astronauts went to the moon. It's more exciting to hear that you may be able to go too.
I believe these things did happen. And then you have St. Paul, who's trying to make sense of what happened.
And that lines up very much with what Tom Holland, when he read Paul and discovered, well, what is Paul doing? Well, Paul is figuring this stuff out. Paul is, when he said in that video, Paul is talking out loud, I thought, well, I guess my parents named me right. He's talking out loud in the epistles. He's trying to figure out, because he has the data from the apostles that I saw Jesus, I saw Jesus, I saw Jesus, I saw Jesus. But again, read N.T. Wright on this, but wait, and you can get it. You don't have to just read N.T. Wright. You can read Martha in John 11, because Jesus is like, you'll see Lazarus again. And Martha says she's, been to synagogue. Yeah, I know. We'll see him on the last day. They've read the book of Daniel. And Jesus says, no, I am the resurrection. What do you mean by that?
And it's mind-blowing to me. It's mind-blowing to read it as a whole and put it into perspective in that, having spent my life in church.
What's mind-blowing about it in part, I mean, and I try to speak of the Bible not from the perspective of a committed believer, and I have my reasons for that.
Cagey.
I guess it's partly because I want to concentrate on what everyone can come to see as true.
That is so interesting. Why? It's exactly the same reason that Randall Wallace just said, I believe, how it's historical. Well, you don't, history was invented. Herodotus had a hand in it, but modernity had a big hand in the project that Tom Holland works on. And when he and Dominic Sandbrook talk about, was there a real Arthur? When you get into that space. But when Peterson makes this move, why is this such a bridge? And again, Rationality Rules nailed it in that one video about Jesus smuggling him and destiny. I don't know why a young man who plays computer games would want to name himself Destiny. It just makes him sound like some girl rock band. But that's just me. Peterson stays on this side of the line for a reason, because he is trying to construct a stairway that other people can follow on. Now, I'm not exactly sure, and one of the things I was going to make a video about today, but I'm not, because I'm going to be out of time in 45 minutes. But I'm really wrestling with the invisible church, because when it comes to Peterson and Holland, that's really where this question is going, and that's in Protestantism. And that's what happens in the Middle Ages and what happens with respect to platforms. But Peterson's clearly, he just basically said right here, I'm building a stairway that people can, and the bottom of the stairway has to be within modernity. And it's leaving it. That's what Peterson's doing.
I suppose. Perhaps that's it.
He doesn't know, because, again, back to the Pageau video, he's not writing himself. What is him? Something is writing in him. Something is writing through him.
But it is remarkable that the Bible does, in fact, make a coherent narrative, because we don't understand that. It was written by a very diverse range of people over a span of time that we can perhaps not even imagine. It's very difficult to tell how old the oldest stories in Genesis particular are. The story of the fall and of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. They bear all the hallmarks of a previous oral tradition that would have existed in a relatively unchanged form for tens of thousands of years, and perhaps even longer than that. And so they're unbelievably ancient. And then parts of it obviously are newer, and the written parts are obviously newer than any tentative oral tradition. But you have at the bare minimum an unbelievably deep psychological document that weaves itself over centuries into a coherent story. And Northrop Frye, I would say, he's a Canadian literary critic, did more for me than any other particular thinker to help me understand the nature of the narrative. Because Frye, and I suppose he did the same thing, or I'm doing the same thing that
you can find Frye's videos on the web.
He did.
And his books.
Because he preceded me, also at the University of Toronto. He assessed the Bible as a work of literature, as a narrative.
Now again, in modernity, we tend to hear that dismissively because science talks about real things and literature just talks about stories we make to amuse ourselves. No.
And that to me was never.
We, again, back to Pageau and Benjamin Boyce, we are creating literature to not only have the patterns move through us, but to get in sync with the patterns and to live them out.
Any denigration, because narrative, a powerful narrative, and you talk about this when you talk about Braveheart, for example, because there isn't that much known about William Wallace historically, but you crafted a narrative that was true enough, let's say, to be unbelievably attractive to people and to motivate them very deeply.
Now think about, so something happened with William Wallace. So let's think about William Wallace's life as the precursor. And let's think about Braveheart as Randall Wallace's story about him. What's the relationship between the precursor and the story? But the story itself takes on a life because the story was written through him. And if you listen to the whole video, that's someone like Randall Wallace, when he writes a story like Braveheart, there's a lot in Wallace. It's not incidental that he's got the same name. And he talks about visiting Scotland and finding the castle and learning about Robert the Bruce. And now there may be issues between the precursor and the story. Okay? There almost always are. But the story then becomes a thing in itself, too. But its relationship to the precursor is also critical. And the story that Randall Wallace tells changes the precursor. And actually, a lot of people don't know this because in the modernist frame, you go to history class to learn about events in the past. But again, in modernity, an event is just this thing that you assume. It's like in an Amazon box. It's like a brick. And if you understand the relationship between the precursor and the story, you begin to realize that that event is subject to relevance realization because it's just a wash of events. I mean, how many times did Julius Caesar cross the Rubicon? Probably lots. But Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon as an event. Why? It's part of the whole story. And Peterson's going to get into this if I shut up.
Because it's an affecting movie. Well, and if it wasn't, it wouldn't have been so popular. And so there's a truth in narrative that I think is even deeper than historical truth. A truly profound narrative truth is like the average of a whole variety of historical truths. And so it's the essence of historical truth.
Okay, so we talked about the precursor and then we talked about the thing. Well, in all likelihood, the events of William Wallace that Randall Wallace is appropriating are not just from William Wallace. They're from Randall Wallace's old past and his father. Tell a lot of moving stories about his father and a whole bunch of other things all get brought into this. And it's that sense in which Peterson has sort of his hyper truth.
So it's even more true than what we would consider, say, eyewitness history, because eyewitness history is just, it's one battle, and there's maybe an epic theme in that battle, but then imagine that you could look at 1,000 battles and you could extract out from that what was canonical about heroic victory across all 1,000 battles.
Now, again, back to the relationship between a physical layer. The physical layer is important to the mythological layer, let's say, because if there's no physical layer, and the mythology, for it to be canonical, there has to be enough of a relationship between the two. But because you're not just drawing from this one precursor, but from multiple other precursors, it isn't going to be just a simple concordism. It's going to have these dynamics of multiple precursors.
You see something like that happening in the Old Testament, and the narrative thread is really quite deep. Societies emerge, formulate, fall off the path, worship false idols, collapse. Right. And then the same thing happens again, and the collapse happens. And the collapse happens because people become too prideful, the kings in particular. They don't listen to the voice of conscience. And a prophetic voice arises and says, you're wandering off the tried and true path, and you're going to be punished terribly for that. And generally speaking, the kings ignore that, and catastrophe breaks free. And you see, and in the Old Testament in particular, there's the promise of the ultimate state in some sense. There's utopian promises that run through it, the search for the promised land. And then so strangely, you see that transformed into something that's not really political in the New Testament. You see that the promise...
You have to listen to a bunch of my sermons over the last 6 months. Not really political, but yet political. But it relativizes and appropriately sets the political in the hierarchy where it needs to be. Okay, the king is always under the god. And so that's important. The king never fully, completely instantiates the god. In the Tom Holland unbelievable conversation, that, well, is God a flawed character? Well, we know that David is a flawed character. And in fact, part of the reason the story is believable, and nobody speaks about David better than I've heard Pageau speak about David, because Pageau's taught me a lot about David. But David is a flawed character, and that's why he's beneath the God. Solomon will be this coming of the kingdom moment when Solomon is coronated, but Solomon will collapse. And so you see this pattern, and then the really difficult pattern then is the pattern of Christ, because he then is the God. Wait, I thought that wasn't supposed to work that way, but it does. But Jesus doesn't sit on a throne in Jerusalem. Where is Jesus' throne? Jesus ascends to his throne. He's seated at the right hand of God the Father. This sets up a lot of questions, the problem of evil, a whole bunch of things, but there are the patterns.
Land becomes the nature of experience as a consequence of a particular form of moral being. And then perhaps that has political implications, because people who acted like that would produce a particular state, but it's no longer the dream of establishing the state that will solve all problems. It's like...
And right here is where I really have to do a lot more thinking in terms of Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson, because there are times when Christianity is instantiated in the state. Think about the Roman Empire. But Christianity changes that, with Constantine, because before Constantine, the emperor was the pontiff. Now, in a sense, the emperor has to share. And that's very Hebrew, because you have prophets out there, you have priests out there, and then you have the king, prophet, priest, and king. You have three. Before that, the emperor is the emperor. But how do these things work together? And a big theme in a lot of Tom Holland's, if you look at his book Millennium, or The Forge of Christianity, it's got 2 titles in different countries. That's something that Holland is always working on, is the Pope and the King. Well, why the Pope and the King? Well, because they're the Pope and the Emperor, but there's multiple emperors, but there's one Pope, and back and forth we go.
Psychologized, and it's unbelievably profound. And that's, I think you can derive all of that from the biblical writings without even starting to move onto classically religious territory. And
I think what he means when he says that is that which has been categorized as religious in the secular frame.
And then that does beg the question, of course, is what does all that wisdom point to in the final analysis? And that's when the questions start to become religious.
Yes. Jordan, that's the part to me that it takes it into a whole whole different realm, as you say. There's a quote.
Because when it comes, well, what do you mean when it becomes religious? Well, now this is something I can participate in. Remember Martin Luther? Well, Christ was ready to blow the trumpet, and Mother Mary fell at his feet and said, "No, think about the Cistercians." "Okay, Mom, I'll hold off a little bit." Martin, of course, is traveling through the woods, and there's a thunderstorm, and, cries out to Saint Anne, "Save me, Saint Anne. Get yourself a cowl. Become a monk." But then being a monk is insufficient, and, off we go with most of the story. It's in the religious that we participate, that Martin Luther sees himself participating at the self level and at the highest level, all together. It's where now all of the meaning lights are on the dashboard. Yeah, all of the meaning, heaven and earth, the whole thing. Even if it's just me in this tiny little corner of the woods on the ground calling out to Saint Anne, and, well, now's the time, Martin. Now's the time. But the cowl alone isn't going to satisfy him.
From Mary Oliver that a friend shared with me recently. It's keep some room in your heart for the unimaginable. And I find that in a great story, in any great piece of art, that surprise is the central currency of its power. There's an element of, if you will, of revelation, if you will. And
okay, revelation. You see, now if I say, pastor's talking about revelation, dismissive. Well, what is this? Well, revelation scales, doesn't it?
That surprise is the central currency of its power. There's an element of, if you will, of revelation, if you will. And I think it was Paul Tillich, I'm not sure, who said that religion is man's way to God and is always erroneous, but revelation is God's way to man. Maybe it was Karl Barth. It's God's way to man and is always perfect. Well, there's a...
Don't ask me which one. I don't know, and I didn't Google it. Go ahead and Google it yourself, and I'm sure you'll get it straight in the comment section.
Revelatory aspect to any great story.
There's a revelatory aspect to anything. Again, we're doing all this dead reckoning because our buffered selves and the secular age and the iron box of secularism, we can't see the stars anymore. So we're looking for these dead reckonings. And Peterson's like, meaning is a gyroscope within the box that we can use to navigate. And story, there's a okay, Pageau says, well, the pattern has to scale. Well, the pattern is too big for us to see because we're small, and so we have to see it in small sections. So revelation comes inside the story, and the revelation, it's surprise, but it's now, again, mysterion for the Apostle Paul is this second story that illuminates all of the precursors and makes sense of the whole thing.
When you're telling someone a story and they didn't see coming what just happened, that's what makes them awake. That's what stabs them broad awake.
That's when you get woke.
In Braveheart, so many people said to me it was when the woman that William Wallace loves, when her throat is cut, that's when suddenly they knew they were not in a typical action movie.
My wife said to my daughter and I, we were watching TV on the couch and we were watching something, and she said, but all of these stories that we watch on TV, we anticipate this ending, but life is, there isn't, oh, guess what? It's May 10. When I go to sleep tonight, that's it. Story over. Good night and goodbye. The end of the Truman Show. Oh, maybe. I mean, my sister and my father dropped dead of heart attacks unexpectedly. So, the videos could stop, and you'll hear on Twitter or something that, they'll do a COVID funeral for Paul Vanderklay. Could happen. I hope not. I I hope I outlive my mother. I know my mother doesn't want to bury any more of her children. But events, life, precursors, and then the story on top, and now something happens, and revelation, and the story is fractaling, it's scaling.
Even to the very end of Braveheart, there would have been many people in Hollywood, and were, who thought, well, this movie needs to end with his friends swinging in on vines and saving him.
And well, why? Well, what about Braveheart? Why is Wallace a Christ figure? Well, he doesn't get up out of the grave, or at least get brought back to life by Superman and Wonder Woman and the Justice League, and he doesn't, get rescued, doesn't pop up after, Agent Anderson's bullets go in him like Neo. And so then, of course, the spirit of William Wallace lives on, and yada, yada, yada. But that's nowhere near as satisfying as, look at my hands. You got a fish?
You can't end an expensive historical epic movie with a guy beheaded and disemboweled. But that was where it had to end for me. But how we get there and what it says surprised me and surprised the audience too. And in that, I think, is how it becomes resonant. I was doing
it's how it becomes resonant. What do you mean by that? That's how it resonates. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, that's exactly what Pageau was talking about. That's how I've felt. What is it? What is resonance? It's a pattern of vibration. And bridges have resonance. What resonance? What do you mean that it has resonance? You vibrate a bridge in a certain way, and it'll come apart. What? Really? Watch the bridge of, you can find it on YouTube. That's a place to share videos. It has resonance. It's something is vibrating. And Peterson talks about music, and that's sort of opened his eyes. Says, what's going on with music? Why is there resonance that I'm picking up that seems meaningful and deep? And maybe it's just all nothing, but no, it's not nothing.
A charity screening of Braveheart a few years ago, for the first time in 2 decades, to sit in a theater and actually see the movie screened, not on television, but projected in a theater, and doing it for a charity in Austin, Texas. And at the end of the movie, I walked up onto the stage to do a Q&A. And the first person who stood up was a young woman in the front row, 19 years old. So she wasn't born when Braveheart had come out. And I was surprised that she stood up first, and she said, "Mr. Wallace, I don't have a question. I just want to tell you something. My fiance died 6 months ago. And before he died, he told me he wanted me to watch Braveheart so I would understand the way he loved me." And I did. I had to stop. I couldn't go on for several minutes. It shocked me. It moved me. It surprised me.
You said that you write love stories, and I guess she put her finger on that, hey? Really
Yes.
profoundly.
So Braveheart was the precursor. Her relationship with her fiancé was the precursor. His death was the precursor. And she shines a light on Braveheart. Peterson sees it. Oh, you said you wrote love stories. Now I see it.
And the idea that men want to be courageous. They want to be willing to sacrifice themselves for what's worth sacrificing for. And women want a man like that. Women want to, and they want to be participants in that story.
And of course, Peterson has been highlighting this, and we're in a moment in the culture where we say, no, men and women are the same. Then why are we talking about that? Because if they're the same, because we don't say, no, eggs and eggs are the same. No, that's because we have one word for them. Why do we have one word, men and women? Oh, that was the patriarchy that gave us two names. Oh, okay. So, it just makes no sense.
In that same journey for themselves. And to me, it's narrative can give you that more than any abstract explanation of it.
Not and not talking about narrative as narrative, being, writing a narrative, creating the art. And this is exactly what Pageau was talking about. And Wallace didn't write a story about Wallace saying, well, I have to get all these elements in. No, he started with the story, and then you accentuate and the artistry, you play it up. You tell a story with the elements of the story.
I don't mean to
there's a lot to unpack in that. I want to go back to your discussion of surprise. Among people who assess information theory, there's a strong association between something that's informative and something that's surprising. If you can predict it, technically speaking, it doesn't contain any information.
It's already mapped. It's already there. The pattern has been there. You might live into it and you might use it, just as when I go to the sink and I move the handle, water comes out. It's not information. It's not revelation.
And so information always comes in the form of surprise, technically speaking. And we are wired.
Now this is Peterson again, building his little staircase.
To form a surprise, technically speaking. And we are wired to attend to what's informative because that's what updates and teaches us. And so then
updates that map, presses on that map, the narrative and the data.
You said revelation comes in the form of surprise, and I would say that's virtually the case by definition, isn't it? Because imagine that you're viewing a narrative through a particular lens. You're in a cognitive perceptual structure, a frame of
cognitive perceptual structure. There's a fancy Peterson word, a cognitive perceptual structure.
Reference that you're using to track all the actions and to make sense of them and to make.
That's your map. That's your narrative on your map. You're using it to track everything. And so you're always checking. Yep, check, yep, check. That's what I expect. I moved my hand. The water came out. That's what I expect. When, just yesterday, again, plumbing issues. I'm waiting on some more plumbing equipment because I've got to do some more plumbing at the house. But, wife did laundry. Laundry tub filled up. Call husband. Laundry tub not empty. Husband's map. Husband, do something so that laundry tub empties. Husband says, yes, I will. Wife says, can I use the washing machine? Husband says, wait till laundry tub empties. Then
make predictions. And if something unexpected happens, that means that you've just learned that frame of reference is no longer applicable to the current circumstances.
Remapping.
And so what that really does mean is that something transcendent, at least from the perspective of that current frame of reference, has in fact occurred, so that's a mini miracle in some sense, right?
It's a mini miracle. Didn't require any extraordinary evidence at all, because it's just regular evidence. Which, seeing through the same eyes, it's just a break in the pattern.
Because a miracle is something that doesn't obey the laws that you're currently following. That's one way of thinking about it. And so a surprising revelation is a mini miracle, and maybe it's because of that it's reminiscent of the fact of the miraculous, generally speaking. But I would also say the narrative does something else if it's profound too. It doesn't just surprise you. It also gives you a new frame of reference.
Right. The data, you're always calibrating your map from the data. You're checking with each other and everybody else's data collecting. We're all doing this together at the same time. And mentally, we're all working on these subconscious maps together, the story outside and the story inside. That's all going on at the same time. We're doing it all the time.
instantly within which that surprise now makes sense.
And that's why when the disciples, when Jesus shows up, shines like a light on Transfiguration Day, that changes them, but it hasn't gone out and remapped. And so Tom Holland's work is basically the remapping of the world from all of those stories on and on and on and on, and all the checking with data. And modernity is, in a sense, did St. Cuthbert's body really not decay? It's data, narrative, check it, back and forth, back and forth.
And if it doesn't, then you're left unsatisfied by the movie. You think, because I've seen that often, particularly in movies. It doesn't seem to happen quite so much in novels, where the
because movies are more complex.
Director and the writer will throw a whole variety of things up in the air.
Or the preacher in a bad sermon. Trust me, I've done it many times.
And it's really compelling. And then about 3/4 of the way through the movie, you think, it'll be really something if all of that gets tied together. And then it doesn't, right?
And then you can get your YouTube movie critics that will point this out. And they'll say, it's a bad movie. Why? Because they didn't bring it together. And again, you can have movies about superheroes or horror movies or any kind of fantasy out there. And we're checking.
It falls flat. It doesn't end in a manner that does justice to what's being set up. So
yeah,
and that's a classic narrative structure, right? There's a stable state to begin with, and then something that disrupts it and throws everything into a state of chaos temporarily, and then the establishment of a new state.
Northrop Frye, all the biblical stories have the same pattern. And the fact that we can express a narrative pattern with a line on a chalkboard, wow, that says something.
And a good story definitely does that for us and guides us through that and shows us that we're the thing that does that as well.
Well, like if you take an Agatha Christie movie or...
I'm out of time. I got to land the plane. I got to stop this video. But I hate to because I'm having so much fun, but I got things to do. So, summary. I should have a summary. Well, it's all the stuff that I've been doing. Okay, we started with the sense making of the world, right? And what's the sense making of the world? Let me go back to that. Sense making is world saving. We have Luther. It's got to connect. It can't be just me. It has to be about everything. But where do I and everything intersect meaningfully and open-endedly? God. Stories about God. Because, well, God is not just a superhero. God is everything. And I don't mean that in a pantheistic sense. It's bigger than that. It can't be defined. We can't define it. That's a better way of saying. Not that it can't be defined. We can't define it. We're too small. God is, of course, the historical term we're looking for. But the moment you domesticate him, you slip back into a meaning crisis, both of yourself and of the world. You want to be the hero, and you want to be the damsel for which the hero moves heaven and earth for love. It's a difficult story to construct. Good thing it's already been done. Now, if it's just a story, that's exciting, but ultimately disappointing and unsatisfying. We want to dress up and act, recreate, participate, long and expect, and tell, and make movies and make art and be in it. And so when we see this story about William Wallace, it's a story about us because it's fractaling up out, the pattern is fractaling up out of the iron box of modernity. It's breaking it, bringing us into the world even for just a moment. Every moment of our life in the seculum must find its place in it while reaching beyond it. Where else can I find this but in Christ? I am disciple and bride. I am lover and beloved. I am child and midwife. I am always on the verge of being lost, but never out of reach of his grip. I understand why people think it's too good to be true. All right, there it is. Let me know what you think in the comment section.